Big and red when you
Yep.
Okay, everybody wave high.
Hi.
Everybody wave high. All right, okay, now sit down. Be done waving and sit down, all you blue, whatever yours is. Whatever's yours is. And we're going to be quiet and we're going to, don't say hi to Grandma, everybody. I guess Grandma could come say hi. Oh, she's going to sit here and make you be good? Oh, no. What are we gonna, is Savannah going to have to be good? All right. Is it still red?
Yeah.
All right, so we're recording. All right, let's go. So this is The Spell Begins to Break, chapter, what is it, 10 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Okay, so we ready to go? 1, 2, 3.
Go.
Go, that's right. All right, now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everybody began bundling themselves into coats except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that hand, and here's a packet of tea, and there's sugar and some matches, and if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" Do you guys want to go on a journey with nothing to eat?
No.
No,
I
that's
knew
right.
you could find berries.
Yeah, not in the winter. It's not in the winter time. Anyway, that's what I say. "But we haven't in time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed in Mr. Beaver. "Get along with all of you," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for 1/4 of an hour at least." "But don't we want as big of a start as we possibly can get?" said Peter. "If we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "As soon as she has looked in here and finds we're gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her, whatever we do, or she'll be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then we have no hope," said Susan. "Now, don't you get fussing there's a dear," said Mrs. Beaver, "but just get a half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of that drawer. Of course, we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "That's true enough," said Mrs. Beaver. "That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband. "But it's time we were out of this. And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loads, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring." "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver, "a great deal too heavy. And you don't think you'll be able to use it while you're on the run, I suppose." "I can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it as likely or not." Okay, anyway. "Oh, please, please, please do hurry," said the 3 children, and so at last they all got outside and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a bit," he said, and they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They went in single file, first Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, then Mrs. Beaver, and Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and on. Come on, just sit back and watch. Just sit back and watch. Thank you. All right, now I lost my place talking to you. I lost my own place is what I did. All right, there we go. Anyway. Oh, that's what he said. They all got outside and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a bit," he said, and they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They went on in single file, first Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan. I've been here already before. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either side. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the top, for you couldn't bring a sledge down here." It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through a window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first, but as they went on walking and walking and walking, and as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all of its waterfalls of ice and all the white masses of the treetops and their great glaring moon and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going patta 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 through the snow in front of her as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared and the snow began to fall once more, and at last Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the riverbank and right to the right and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then she came fully awake, she found that Mr. Beaver had just vanished into a little hole in the bank, which had almost been hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing out of the hole. Lucy immediately stooped down, and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Whatever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale. What is a voice that sounds pale? Anybody know?
Like,
What's a pale voice? What is it?
like after you have a pale face, it's really pale. That kind of color, like after you not like when you've been running.
What do you say, Tyler?
You're tired.
What do you say? A pale voice. That means it's a tired voice. You got it right.
Like,
Yep, you got it right.
Yep, that's a pale face.
Like a pale face and then a pale voice. All right. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours of sleep. If you hadn't been such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly as nice of a cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought. Just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy, and it was very small, so that when they all lay down together, they were in a bundle of clothes together, and with that, and being warmed up by their long walk, they were really quite snug. And if only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mistress Beaver handed around a dark little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and sputter a little, and then stung the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you had swallowed it, and everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, although really it was hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, and thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that, she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and their eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was the very sound they'd been thinking of and sometimes imagining they heard during that walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Why on earth is there jingling bells out in the snow in Narnia? That's a good question.
I know.
Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought it for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do, but it was really a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and brambles without being seen, and he wanted above all things to see which way the witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes, and then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen. She's caught him." Great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling them out from just outside the cave. "It's all right," he was shouting. "Come out, Mrs. Beaver. Come out, sons and daughters of Adam. It is all right. It isn't her." This was the bad grammar, of course, but everybody was thinking about who her was. Who was her?
The white witch.
The witch, right, yeah. It's all right. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight and with earth all over them and looking very frowsty and unbrushed and uncombed and with sleep in their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see. This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling." "What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" panted Peter as they all climbed up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," answered Mr. Beaver, "that she'd made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, come and see." And when they were out at the top, they all did see. It was a sledge, and it was reindeer with bells on their harnesses, but they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer, and they were not white, but brown, and on the sledge sat a person whom everybody knew that moment they set their eyes on him. He was a huge man with a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside it and a great white beard that fell like foamy waterfalls on his chest. Everyone knew him because, though you see people of this sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear of them talked about even in our world, the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it is rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look funny and jolly. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that. He was big and glad and real, but that all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also solemn. What is it?
It's Santa Claus.
It's Santa Claus.
Santa Claus!
Or else it's Father Christmas, who's a little different than Santa Claus, and we're going to hear about
He's
that.
Saint Nick.
Well, it's a little different. We get Santa Claus from this idea, but he's going to talk about this guy now, okay? And now, said Father Christmas, oh, no, he says, I've come at last, said he. She has kept me out for a long time, but I have gotten in at last. Aslan is on the move, the witch's magic is weakening, and Lucy felt running through her that deep shiver of gladness, which you only get if you are being solemn and still. And now, said Father Christmas, for your presents, there is a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver. I will drop it at your house as I pass. Do you think she'll like a new sewing machine?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she will like a new sewing machine, yeah. If you please, sir, said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy, it's locked up. Locks and bolts make no difference to me, said Father Christmas. And as for you, Mr. Beaver, when you get home, you will find your dam finished and mended, and all the leaks stopped, and a new sluice gate fitted. Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide and then found he couldn't say anything at all. Peter's, Adam's son, said Father Christmas. Here, sir, said Peter. These are your presents. Here are your presents, was the answer. They are tools, not toys. The time to use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well. And with these words, he handed to Peter a sword and a shield. A sword and a shield. The shield was the color of silver, and across it there ramped a red lion as bright as a ripe strawberry at the moment when you pick it up. The hilt of the sword was of gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt and everything it needed, and it was just the right size and weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt they were a very serious kind of present. Susan, Eve's daughter, said Father Christmas, these are for you. And he handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows and a little ivory horn. You must use the bow only in great need, he said, for I do not mean you to fight in the battle. It does not easily miss, and when you put this horn to your lips and blow it, then, wherever you are, I think some kind of help will come to you. Last of all, he said, Lucy, Eve's daughter. And Lucy came forward. He gave her a little bottle of what looked like glass, but people said afterwards that it was made of diamond, and a small dagger. Who knows what a dagger is? It's a knife. It's a knife for poking people. No, it's for really poking people bad. At any rate, in this bottle, he said, there is a cordial made of the juice of one of the fire flowers that grow in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends is hurt, a few drops of this will restore them. And the dagger is to defend yourself at great need, for you are also not to be in the battle. Why, sir, said Lucy, I don't know, but I think I would be brave enough. That is not the point, he said. But battles are ugly when women fight. And now, here, he suddenly looked less grave. Here is something for the moment for you all. And he brought out, I suppose from the big bag at his back, but nobody quite saw him do it, a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl of lump sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. So how do you think he got that out of his pocket?
He's magical.
Probably because he's magical, yeah. And he cried out, Merry Christmas, long live the true king, and cracked his whip, and he and the reindeer and the sledge were out of sight before anyone realized that they had started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of the sheath and was showing it to Mr. Beaver when Mrs. Beaver said, Now then, don't stand here talking till the teas got cold, just like men. Come and help to carry the tray down and we'll have a breakfast. What a mercy, I thought of bringing a bread knife. So, down the steep bank they went and back to the cave, and Mr. Beaver cut up some bread and ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured out the tea, and everyone enjoyed themselves. But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, Mr. Beaver said, time to be moving on now. By the way there, Savannah, you did not even ask how many pages there was, and you got to the end anyway.
There you go.
How do you like that?
Look at that.
You did good. You did good. All right, can you shut that off, please?
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Just punch that button and